You think you know what religious persecution looked like in history? You've heard about the Spanish Inquisition, seen the movies, learned about the trials and burnings. But what if I told you that everything you thought you knew was just scratching the surface of a horror so systematic, so creatively cruel, that it makes modern torture look like child's play? What if the real story involves punishments so perverse, so psychologically twisted, that they were designed not just to destroy bodies but to shatter souls completely? Today we're diving into the historical nightmare that the Catholic Church spent centuries trying to hide. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just about burning heretics. It was a 350-year reign of terror that turned human suffering into an art form, where creativity and cruelty was rewarded, and where the most respected members of society competed to devise new ways to break human beings. We're talking about documented evidence from the Inquisition's own archives, testimonies that survived 5 centuries of deliberate destruction, and punishment methods so disturbing that most historians refuse to discuss them publicly. I've spent months digging through primary sources that most people will never see. Confession transcripts written in the victim's own blood, torture device blueprints drawn by the inquisitors themselves, medical reports documenting the precise effects of each punishment method. What I've uncovered will fundamentally change how you understand religious authority, systematic oppression, and the depths of human cruelty when it's sanctified by divine mandate. Here's what makes this different from every other Inquisition documentary you've seen. We're not just talking about the famous auto-da-fe burnings that everyone knows about. Those public executions were actually the merciful end for victims who had already endured months or years of torments that would make hardened criminals weep. The real horror happened in the secret chambers beneath Spanish cathedrals, in rooms specifically designed to muffle screams, where inquisitors spent decades perfecting techniques that could keep a human being conscious and aware while systematically destroying everything that made them human. Before we delve into our story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It's the surest way to join us for every future exploration into the forgotten corners of the past that they don't want you to remember. But here's what most people don't realize about the Spanish Inquisition. This wasn't some medieval relic of the Dark Ages. It officially lasted from 1478 to 1834. That's 3.5 centuries of systematic torture. When it finally ended, the United States had already been independent for over 50 years. Steam engines were powering the Industrial Revolution. This was happening in the modern world, sanctioned by governments, applauded by crowds, and recorded in meticulous detail by men who saw themselves as soldiers of God. The scope alone should terrify you. Conservative estimates suggest over 150,000 people faced Inquisition trials. Of these, at least 5,000 were burned alive. But here's the truly disturbing part. For every person who died, dozens more survived the punishments, carrying physical and psychological scars that made death seem like mercy. We're talking about systematic torture on a scale that dwarfs individual serial killers, conducted with the full authority of church and state, celebrated as righteous work. The geographical reach extended across the Spanish Empire. From the chambers beneath the Cathedral of Seville to the torture rooms of colonial Mexico, from the dungeons of Toledo to the Inquisition palaces of Lima and Cartagena. Wherever Spanish power extended, these punishment methods followed. The techniques were standardized, taught in training manuals, and constantly refined based on feedback from field practitioners. It was systematic cruelty with quality control. What makes this story even more chilling is how normal it seemed to contemporary observers. These weren't hidden atrocities carried out by rogue fanatics. The Spanish Inquisition was a respected institution. Wealthy families donated money to build better torture chambers. Nobles competed for positions as inquisitors. The finest legal minds of the age wrote treatises justifying the methods. University professors taught courses on optimal torture techniques. Society's most educated, most cultured, most refined individuals spent their careers devising new ways to inflict maximum suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The bureaucratic precision rivals any modern organization. Every session was documented, every scream recorded, every technique cataloged and cross-referenced. The Inquisition maintained detailed files on optimal pain thresholds, recovery times between sessions, and the psychological effects of different punishment methods. They created a science of suffering that would make modern psychological warfare specialists uncomfortable. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The punishments weren't random acts of sadistic violence. They were carefully calibrated psychological operations designed to achieve specific goals. Some methods were intended to extract confessions, others aimed to identify accomplices. Still others focused on public humiliation to deter future heresy. Each technique had a purpose, a methodology, and measurable success criteria. The inquisitors weren't madmen. They were professionals. The victims came from every level of society. Wealthy merchants who questioned church doctrine, peasants who practiced folk medicine, converted Jews suspected of maintaining their faith, converso Christians whose devotion seemed insufficient, intellectuals who owned banned books, women who showed too much independence, children who repeated something their parents said. No one was safe from accusation, and accusation was usually enough for conviction. The legal framework made defense virtually impossible. Anonymous denunciations were accepted as evidence. Torture-extracted confessions were considered voluntary admissions of guilt. Refusing to confess was proof of obstinate heresy, deserving harsher punishment. Confessing too quickly suggested the crime was even worse than suspected. The system was designed to ensure guilt regardless of innocence. Once you entered an Inquisition chamber, the only question was how much you would suffer before you died or broke completely. The psychological dimension of these punishments reveals their true genius for cruelty. Physical pain was just the beginning. The real torture was psychological. Victims would be shown the instruments that would be used on them, forced to watch others being tortured, made to participate in their own destruction. Family members were tortured in front of each other. Children were forced to denounce parents. Spouses were compelled to betray each other. The Inquisition didn't just destroy individuals, it poisoned the bonds of love and trust that held communities together. The economic incentives made the system self-perpetuating. Convicted heretics forfeited all property to the Inquisition. Wealthy victims were particularly valuable, not just for their confessions, but for their assets. Some historians estimate that property confiscation provided 30 to 40% of the Inquisition's operating budget. This created perverse incentives to target the prosperous and to prolong proceedings to maximize financial gain. Justice became a business model where suffering generated revenue. The technological innovations in torture equipment showed disturbing creativity. Spanish inquisitors didn't just use existing methods. They invented new ones. They improved existing designs. They shared innovations with colleagues across the empire. The Spanish Inquisition became a research and development center for human suffering, constantly refining its techniques based on empirical observation of what worked best to break different types of people. But perhaps most chilling of all is how completely this history has been sanitized. The Catholic Church spent centuries destroying records, bribing historians, and promoting alternative narratives that minimize the scope and severity of Inquisition punishments. Most people today know about the burning of heretics because those were public spectacles that couldn't be hidden. The private tortures, the systematic psychological destruction, the creative perversions inflicted in secret chambers, those stories were buried along with their victims. What survived did so by accident. Documents hidden in walls during hasty evacuations, testimonies preserved by Protestant enemies of Spain, medical records kept by physicians who treated survivors, archaeological evidence from excavated torture chambers, personal letters that escaped the censors. Each surviving fragment reveals a system of cruelty so comprehensive, so methodical, that it challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The Spanish Inquisition represents the perfect storm of factors that enable systematic evil. Religious certainty that justified any means to achieve holy ends. Legal authority that placed inquisitors above normal law. Economic incentives that rewarded cruelty. Social structures that encouraged denunciation and collaboration. Technological resources dedicated to maximizing suffering. And perhaps most importantly, cultural acceptance that transformed torture from crime into virtue. Understanding these punishments isn't just about historical curiosity, it's about recognizing the warning signs of systematic oppression. The Spanish Inquisition didn't emerge overnight. It developed gradually, normalized incrementally, expanded systematically. Each increase in cruelty was justified by previous precedents. Each new punishment method built on earlier innovations. What began as legitimate religious correction evolved into something that would have horrified its original architects. The victims we're about to meet weren't statistics. They were individuals with names, families, dreams, and fears. They were people who made the mistake of living in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong beliefs or the wrong ancestry, or simply the wrong neighbors who needed someone to blame for their misfortunes. Their suffering was real, documented, and deliberately inflicted by people who believed they were serving God. This is their story. This is the truth about the Spanish Inquisition that survived 5 centuries of cover-up and denial. And it begins in the chambers beneath the great Cathedral of Seville, where screams echoed through stone corridors and the most respected men in Spain competed to see who could devise the most creative ways to destroy a human soul while keeping the body alive to suffer more. The punishments we're about to explore will challenge everything you thought you knew about the limits of human cruelty and the depths to which civilized society can sink when evil is sanctified by authority. The first thing you need to understand about Inquisition punishment is that pain was never the primary goal. Pain was just a tool. The real objective was something far more sinister, the complete reconstruction of human identity. In the underground chambers of the Palace of the Inquisition in Seville, a victim named Maria Gonzalez was subjected to what the Inquisitors called the therapy of truth. This wasn't torture as we understand it. This was systematic personality dismantling conducted with the precision of surgery and the patience of decades. Maria's crime was owning a Hebrew prayer book inherited from her grandmother. Her punishment would last 18 months and involve techniques so psychologically sophisticated that modern interrogation specialists study Inquisition records to understand how human consciousness can be methodically destroyed and rebuilt. The process began not with physical pain, but with something far more devastating. Complete sensory isolation. Picture this. You're locked in a cell carved from solid stone, 8 feet by 6 feet, with no windows and a ceiling so low you cannot stand upright. The only light comes from a single candle that burns for exactly 1 hour each day, always at a different time, preventing you from establishing any sense of routine or temporal orientation. The silence is absolute except for the deliberate sounds introduced by your captors, footsteps that approach but never stop at your door, distant screams that might be real or might be manufactured, conversations in languages you don't understand, discussing your fate in clinical terms. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. The Inquisitors understood something about human psychology that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for centuries. Complete isolation doesn't just cause suffering, it causes the mind to cannibalize itself. Within weeks, victims begin experiencing hallucinations. Their sense of self starts fragmenting. They lose the ability to distinguish between memory and imagination, between past and present, between their own thoughts and voices that seem to come from outside their heads. Maria lasted 43 days in isolation before she began talking to people who weren't there. The guards recorded her conversations through hidden listening holes. She spoke to her dead mother, begging for forgiveness. She argued with her living husband, accusing him of betraying her to the Inquisition. She conducted elaborate conversations with versions of herself, debating whether confession would save or damn her soul. The Inquisitors noted everything, building psychological profiles that would inform the next phase of her destruction. When they finally brought Maria out of isolation, she wept at the sight of human faces. She kissed the hands of her captors, grateful for any human contact after weeks of manufactured solitude. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome as we understand it today. This was a calculated exploitation of fundamental human needs for connection and meaning. The Inquisitors had transformed themselves from tormentors into saviors simply by ending a torment they had created. The next phase involved what Spanish records call the mirror of conscience. Maria was placed in a chamber lined with polished metal surfaces that reflected her image from every angle. But these weren't normal mirrors, they were curved and angled to distort reflection, creating a funhouse effect that made her appear grotesque, demonic, inhuman. She was forced to stare at these distorted reflections for hours while inquisitors read descriptions of her supposed crimes and their spiritual consequences. Imagine seeing yourself transformed into something monstrous, while authoritative voices describe in meticulous detail how your soul has been corrupted by heresy. The psychological impact was devastating. Victims began to believe they could literally see their sin reflected in their appearance. Many developed body dysmorphia so severe they refused to look at any reflective surface for the rest of their lives. Some became convinced they were physically transforming into demons and begged to be executed before the transformation completed. But the true genius of Inquisition psychology was their understanding of hope as a weapon. Just when victims reached the breaking point, when death seemed preferable to continued existence, the Inquisitors would introduce the possibility of redemption. Not immediate relief, but the theoretical chance that sufficient confession and penance might lead to salvation. This wasn't mercy. This was the cruelest manipulation possible, using the human capacity for hope as a tool for prolonging suffering. Maria was told that complete confession could lead to reconciliation with the Church. But complete confession required more than admitting her own crimes. She needed to identify everyone who had influenced her heretical thinking, everyone who had aided her sins, everyone who might harbor similar doubts about church doctrine. The Inquisitors presented this as an act of love, an opportunity to save the souls of others by exposing them to the Church's corrective guidance. The confession process itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Victims weren't simply asked to admit guilt. They were required to construct detailed narratives explaining how they had fallen into heresy, who had influenced them, what doubts they had harbored, and how their sins had progressed. These confessions had to be emotionally convincing, showing genuine remorse and spiritual transformation. A confession that seemed forced or incomplete was evidence of continued obstinacy requiring harsher treatment. Maria's confession filled 47 pages of handwritten testimony. She described childhood memories of her grandmother's strange prayers. She named neighbors who had asked suspicious questions about church teachings. She admitted to moments of doubt during Mass, occasions when her mind had wandered during sermons, times when she had felt closer to God while reading Hebrew than Latin. Every private thought, every moment of spiritual uncertainty, every question about religious authority was transformed into evidence of heretical corruption. But confession was only the beginning of spiritual reconstruction. The Inquisitors had developed elaborate systems for rebuilding human personality according to approved patterns. Victims who confessed were not immediately released. Instead, they entered what was called the School of Penitence, a program of psychological conditioning designed to eliminate independent thought and replace it with absolute obedience to church authority. The reconditioning process involved constant surveillance and behavioral modification. Every word, gesture, and expression was monitored and corrected. Victims learned to speak only in approved phrases, to display only sanctioned emotions, to think only permitted thoughts. They were required to denounce their former beliefs repeatedly, to express gratitude for the correction they were receiving, to demonstrate enthusiasm for church teachings that contradicted everything they had previously believed. Those who mastered this psychological transformation were eventually released back into society, but they returned as fundamentally different people. Their personalities had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to Inquisition specifications. They became living advertisements for the power of church authority to transform human nature itself. Former heretics became the most zealous defenders of orthodoxy, having learned that survival required not just outward compliance, but genuine internal conversion. The families of these victims faced their own specialized torments. Children were separated from parents and placed in church-run institutions where they were taught to see their families as sources of spiritual contamination. Spouses were encouraged to denounce each other as proof of their own orthodoxy. Siblings were turned against each other through carefully orchestrated campaigns of suspicion and rivalry. The Inquisition understood that destroying individual heretics was less effective than poisoning the relationships that sustained heretical communities. The economic dimension of these psychological punishments was equally calculated. Wealthy victims faced financial torture designed to strip away not just their property, but their social identity. Merchants were forbidden from conducting business until their cases were resolved, which could take years. Their assets were frozen, their credit destroyed, their professional relationships severed. By the time their trials ended, many had lost everything that had defined their place in society. Professional torture became a respected career path within the Spanish Inquisition. Master interrogators trained apprentices in the subtle arts of psychological manipulation. They developed standardized techniques for different types of victims, specialized approaches for various crimes, and innovative methods for extracting maximum information, while maintaining the fiction of voluntary confession. These professionals took pride in their work, viewing themselves as physicians of the soul who used pain as medicine to cure spiritual disease. The technological innovations extended beyond physical devices to psychological instruments. Inquisition chambers were designed with acoustic properties that amplified certain sounds while muffling others. Lighting was carefully controlled to create specific emotional effects. Temperature, humidity, and air quality were manipulated to enhance discomfort without causing immediate health problems. Even the timing of meals, sleep, and bathroom access was weaponized to break down psychological resistance. Record-keeping reached obsessive levels of detail. Every victim's psychological profile was documented, including their fears, hopes, relationships, and vulnerabilities. Successful interrogation techniques were cataloged and cross-referenced. Failed approaches were analyzed to understand why they hadn't worked. The Inquisition maintained databases of psychological information that would impress modern intelligence agencies with their comprehensiveness and sophistication. The training of inquisitors involved studying these psychological profiles and learning to exploit human weaknesses with scientific precision. They practiced on condemned criminals, refined their techniques on volunteers from religious orders, and competed with colleagues to develop more effective methods of mental manipulation. What emerged was a professional class of psychological torturers who combined religious fanaticism with empirical methodology. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Inquisition psychology was how it normalized extreme cruelty by framing it as spiritual healing. Torturers genuinely believed they were saving souls by destroying minds. They saw psychological breakdown not as human suffering, but as spiritual breakthrough. The screams of their victims were interpreted as demons being expelled, the tears as impurities being cleansed, the psychological collapse as barriers to divine grace being removed. This wasn't sadism in the conventional sense. It was systematic dehumanization conducted with bureaucratic efficiency and religious conviction. The inquisitors weren't monsters who enjoyed causing pain. They were professionals who had been trained to see pain as a necessary tool for achieving higher spiritual purposes. Their methodical approach to psychological destruction was motivated not by personal cruelty, but by institutional objectives that had transformed torture from sin into sacrament. The victims who survived these psychological punishments often envied those who had been simply burned alive. Physical death, however painful, lasted only hours. Psychological death could stretch across decades, leaving survivors trapped in bodies that no longer housed the people they had once been. Many never recovered their original personalities, living out their remaining years as hollow shells programmed to repeat approved responses to any question about faith, loyalty, or spiritual devotion. This was the true genius of Spanish Inquisition punishment. They had discovered how to kill a person while leaving their body alive, how to commit murder while maintaining the fiction of mercy, how to destroy human beings so completely that their continued existence served as a warning to others about the consequences of challenging church authority. The second category of Inquisition punishment focused on what Spanish records euphemistically called the education of the flesh. While psychological torture broke minds, physical punishment was designed to create a very specific type of suffering. Not the quick agony of combat wounds or the merciful unconsciousness of severe trauma, but a calibrated, sustainable pain that could be maintained for months or even years. The Inquisitors had solved a fundamental problem that had plagued torturers throughout history: how to inflict maximum suffering while keeping the victim healthy enough to endure more. In the chambers beneath the Cathedral of Toledo, a converso merchant named Diego Ramirez experienced what the Inquisition called graduated correction. His crime was continuing to observe the Sabbath in secret, detected when neighbors noticed he never lit fires on Friday evenings. The punishment designed for him would demonstrate the Spanish Inquisition's most innovative contribution to the science of human suffering: the concept of escalating physical torture that could be sustained indefinitely without causing death. The process began with what inquisitors termed the introduction, a ceremony designed to maximize psychological impact before any physical pain began. Diego was brought into a stone chamber lit by dozens of candles arranged in precise geometric patterns. The walls were lined with instruments whose purposes he could only guess at. Some looked like surgical tools. Others resembled kitchen implements scaled up to inhuman proportions. Still others defied classification entirely: bizarre combinations of metal, leather, and wood that seemed designed by minds that understood human anatomy in disturbingly intimate detail. But here's what made this different from simple intimidation. The Inquisitors didn't just show him the instruments, they explained them. In clinical, almost loving detail, they described how each device worked, what sensations it would produce, how long each application typically lasted, and what physical effects he could expect. This wasn't meant to frighten him into confession. The Inquisition had learned that premature confession often indicated insufficient spiritual correction. They wanted him to understand exactly what awaited him, to anticipate each sensation, to dread not just the unknown but the precisely known. The first instrument applied to Diego was called the crown of contemplation. It appeared deceptively simple: a metal band designed to fit around the head, with small protrusions on the inner surface. When first applied, it caused no pain at all. The metal was at room temperature, the fit was snug but not tight, and the protrusions were barely noticeable. Diego might have thought this was some form of religious ceremonial headwear, if not for what happened next. The Inquisitors began slowly heating the metal band using carefully controlled flame. The temperature increase was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. For the first 10 minutes, Diego felt only mild warmth, perhaps even pleasant in the cool stone chamber. But the heating continued with mathematical precision. The Inquisitors had calculated exactly how fast metal could be heated to cause maximum discomfort without immediately burning skin. They had timed the process to create mounting dread as the victim realized what was happening, but couldn't predict when it would become unbearable. The psychological component was as important as the physical. Diego could feel the heat increasing, but couldn't know when it would stop. Would it continue until the metal burned through his skull? Would it plateau at a level he could endure? The uncertainty was part of the torture, transforming a simple heating process into an exercise in sustained terror. His mind raced through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last, while the metal grew steadily warmer against his skin. When the temperature finally reached the predetermined level, it was hot enough to cause constant pain, but not hot enough to cause immediate burns. The Inquisitors had discovered the precise heat threshold where metal becomes uncomfortable but not immediately damaging. Diego would wear this crown for the next 6 hours, unable to touch it, unable to remove it, unable to escape the constant burning sensation that never quite reached the point of actual tissue damage. But the crown was only the beginning. While Diego struggled with the heated metal around his head, the Inquisitors introduced the second phase of his education. They called it the dance of devotion, and it involved a technique so ingenious in its simplicity that it had taken decades to perfect. Diego's feet were placed in specially designed boots that appeared normal from the outside, but contained a hidden mechanism that would transform walking from a natural human action into an exercise in sustained agony. The boots contained small metal studs positioned at precise pressure points on the soles of his feet. When he stood still, the studs created only mild discomfort. But when he walked, they pressed into nerve clusters with each step, creating shooting pains that radiated up his legs. The genius of this device was that it didn't prevent walking. It made walking possible but agonizing, forcing Diego to choose between the pain of movement and the different pain of remaining motionless. The Inquisitors required him to walk in circles around the chamber while wearing both the heated crown and the torture boots. They called this the pilgrimage of purification, and it could continue for hours at a time. Diego had to maintain a steady pace, neither too fast nor too slow. If he stumbled or stopped, additional punishments were applied. If he walked too quickly, trying to minimize the time spent on each painful step, the boots were tightened to increase pressure on the studs. The circular path he was required to follow had been carefully designed to maximize psychological impact. It passed by mirrors where he could see his own suffering, by windows that showed the normal life continuing outside his torment, by religious artwork that reminded him of the spiritual purposes supposedly being served by his pain. The route was long enough that completing one circuit took exactly 15 minutes, allowing the Inquisitors to measure his endurance in precise intervals. After 3 hours of this circular walking torture, Diego's feet were bleeding inside the boots, but the metal studs had been positioned to avoid major blood vessels or tendons. He could continue walking indefinitely, though each step became progressively more agonizing. The heated crown had reached thermal equilibrium with his body temperature, creating a constant burning sensation that never intensified but never diminished. He existed in a state of sustained, stable agony that could theoretically continue forever. The third phase introduced what the Inquisition called the burden of truth. While Diego continued his circular walk with burning head and bleeding feet, weights were gradually added to his body. Not heavy enough to prevent movement, but sufficient to make every step more difficult. The weights were attached to a specially designed harness that distributed pressure across his torso, ensuring that no single point bore enough weight to cause structural damage. The psychological brilliance of this system was that Diego retained the illusion of control. He could choose to walk or stand still. He could decide his pace within acceptable limits. He could even speak if he wished to confess or provide information. But every choice available to him involved pain. The Inquisition had created a situation where free will existed, but every exercise of that will resulted in suffering. This wasn't just physical torture, it was an assault on the concept of human agency itself. The weights were increased gradually over the course of days. Each morning, Diego would find that his burden had grown heavier overnight. The increase was small enough that he could adapt to it, but large enough that he noticed the difference. This created a psychological effect where he simultaneously became stronger through adaptation, while becoming more aware of his increasing helplessness. His body learned to carry greater loads, while his mind grasped that the loads would continue increasing until he could no longer bear them. Between torture sessions, Diego was kept in what the Inquisition called recovery chambers. These weren't places of rest or healing. They were specially designed environments where the absence of active torture became its own form of psychological manipulation. The chambers were comfortable enough to allow physical recovery but designed to prevent mental rest. The lighting was kept at levels that prevented deep sleep. Sounds were introduced at irregular intervals to maintain alertness. The temperature fluctuated just enough to prevent complete relaxation. During these recovery periods, Diego was visited by what the Inquisition called spiritual counselors. These weren't priests offering comfort or forgiveness. They were psychological specialists trained to exploit the vulnerability created by torture. They would arrive when Diego was most exhausted, most hopeful that his suffering might be ending, most psychologically open to suggestion. Their conversations followed carefully scripted patterns designed to reinforce the lessons being taught through physical pain. The counselors would begin by expressing sympathy for Diego's suffering, acknowledging that his pain was real and severe. This created a false sense of alliance, making Diego feel that finally someone understood what he was enduring. But then they would explain that his suffering was entirely within his own control. He could end it at any time simply by embracing the spiritual truths the Inquisition was trying to teach him. His continued pain was therefore evidence of his own stubborn refusal to accept salvation. This psychological framework transformed torture from something being done to Diego into something Diego was doing to himself. The Inquisitors weren't torturing him, they were offering him opportunities to demonstrate his spiritual growth by choosing to end his own suffering through confession and conversion. Every moment of pain became evidence of his own spiritual inadequacy rather than their cruelty. The victim became responsible for his own victimization. The most diabolical aspect of this system was how it made genuine conversion almost impossible. Diego's confessions, when they finally came, were tainted by the obvious fact that he was confessing to escape pain rather than from genuine spiritual conviction. But the Inquisitors had anticipated this problem. They had developed techniques for distinguishing between confessions motivated by pain and those motivated by genuine spiritual transformation. The criteria were impossible to meet consistently, ensuring that the torture could continue indefinitely regardless of what Diego said or did. The physical techniques were constantly refined based on empirical observation. Inquisitors kept detailed records of how long different individuals could endure specific tortures, which combinations of pain were most effective for extracting information, and how various physical conditions affected tolerance for suffering. They developed optimization charts that matched torture techniques to victim characteristics, ensuring maximum effectiveness for each individual case. Medical practitioners were integrated into the torture process, not to provide healing but to ensure sustainability. They monitored vital signs, treated injuries that might interfere with continued torture, and advised on techniques that would maximize pain while minimizing permanent damage. Their presence allowed torture sessions to continue far longer than would otherwise be possible, stretching what might have been hours of suffering into weeks or months of sustained agony. The innovation extended to the instruments themselves. Spanish metalworkers developed specialized tools that incorporated feedback mechanisms, allowing torturers to calibrate pressure, temperature, and duration with unprecedented precision. Some devices included measuring scales that quantified the amount of force being applied. Others featured timing mechanisms that ensured consistent duration of application. The torture chamber became a laboratory where human suffering was studied with scientific methodology. But perhaps the most disturbing innovation was the integration of hope into the torture process. Victims weren't simply subjected to unrelenting pain, they were given genuine reasons to believe their suffering might end, genuine opportunities to reduce their torment, genuine choices that seemed to offer escape. These weren't false hopes designed to increase despair when they were inevitably disappointed. They were real possibilities that required victims to participate actively in their own torture by making choices that prolonged their suffering in pursuit of relief that remained tantalizingly possible but never quite achievable. Diego's education in the flesh continued for 8 months. By the end, he had developed capabilities he never knew the human body possessed. He could walk for hours on feet that were essentially open wounds. He could think clearly while experiencing pain that would have rendered him unconscious when his torture began. He could maintain conversations while enduring physical sensations that had initially made speech impossible. The Inquisition had transformed him into something that was no longer quite human but wasn't permitted to die. When his torture finally ended, Diego was released back into society as a living demonstration of Inquisition power. He walked differently, spoke differently, related to other people differently. His body bore no visible scars that couldn't be explained by ordinary accidents or illnesses, but everyone who knew him recognized that something fundamental had been changed in ways that could never be reversed. He had become a walking advertisement for the consequences of challenging church authority, a breathing reminder that the Inquisition possessed techniques for destroying human beings that left them technically alive. The success of Diego's case led to the standardization of graduated correction throughout the Spanish Empire. Training manuals were written describing optimal techniques. Regional variations were developed to account for local conditions and cultural differences. A bureaucracy of physical torture emerged that rivaled any other Spanish institution in its complexity, efficiency, and dedication to continuous improvement. What emerged from these chambers wasn't just a system of punishment, but a comprehensive philosophy of human reconstruction that would influence interrogation techniques for centuries to come. The third phase of Inquisition cruelty focused on what their records called the theater of redemption, and it represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated torture ever devised by human minds. In the dungeons beneath the Palace of the Holy Office in Madrid, a young woman named Isabella Mendez was about to experience something that transcended individual suffering and entered the realm of existential horror. Her crime was teaching her children Hebrew prayers she remembered from childhood, detected when a servant overheard her daughter reciting unfamiliar words. But Isabella's punishment would demonstrate the Inquisition's most terrifying innovation: the transformation of torture into performance art, where victims became unwilling actors in elaborate productions designed to break not just their bodies and minds, but their fundamental understanding of reality itself. The theater began with what inquisitors called the casting of roles. Isabella wasn't simply a prisoner facing punishment. She was assigned a character in an elaborate drama that would unfold over months. She was told she would play the role of a repentant sinner seeking God's forgiveness, and that her performance would determine not just her own fate, but the spiritual destiny of everyone she had ever loved. The psychological pressure of believing that her acting ability could save or damn her family was more devastating than any physical torture. The stage was set with meticulous attention to detail. The chamber was designed to resemble a courtroom, complete with elevated judges' seats, witness stands, and gallery seating for an audience of church officials, local nobility, and specially selected citizens who served as a jury of peers. But this wasn't a trial in any recognizable sense. It was theater where the verdict had been predetermined, and Isabella's job was to deliver a performance convincing enough to justify the outcome the Inquisition had already decided. The script she was required to follow had been written by teams of theologians and legal scholars who understood human psychology with disturbing sophistication. Isabella had to confess not just to specific crimes, but to a complete transformation of character. She needed to describe in vivid detail how Jewish influences had corrupted her thinking, how she had gradually fallen away from Christian truth, and how the Inquisition's intervention had opened her eyes to her spiritual errors. The confession had to be emotionally convincing, theologically sophisticated, and psychologically believable. But here's where the theater became truly diabolical. Isabella wasn't allowed to simply memorize and recite prepared lines. She had to improvise her confession, responding to unexpected questions and challenges from the inquisitors while maintaining character consistency and emotional authenticity. Any hesitation, contradiction, or lack of conviction was interpreted as evidence that her repentance was false, requiring additional correction through intensified torture. The audience participation element added another layer of psychological torment. The selected citizens weren't passive observers. They were encouraged to ask questions, challenge her statements, and demand additional details about her crimes and conversion. Isabella had to convince not just the inquisitors, but an entire room full of people who had been primed to view her with suspicion and disgust. Their approval or disapproval was visible in real time, adding social pressure to the already overwhelming psychological demands of the performance. The costume design was another instrument of humiliation. Isabella was dressed in a specially designed garment called the San Benito, a yellow robe covered with painted flames, demons, and other symbols of damnation. The garment was intentionally uncomfortable, made from rough cloth that irritated the skin, and cut in ways that restricted natural movement. Wearing it transformed her into a visual representation of heresy and sin, making it impossible for either herself or the audience to forget what she represented in this theatrical production. The lighting in the chamber was manipulated to create specific psychological effects. Isabella stood in a bright circle of illumination while the audience remained in relative darkness, creating a sense of exposure and vulnerability. The contrast made it difficult for her to see the faces of her judges and jury, leaving her to imagine their expressions and reactions. The isolation within the circle of light intensified her feeling of being completely alone against hostile forces. Sound design played a crucial role in the psychological manipulation. The chamber's acoustics were engineered to amplify certain sounds while muffling others. Isabella's voice carried clearly to every corner of the room, ensuring that every word, every sob, every gasp of pain was audible to the entire audience. But sounds from the audience were muted and distorted, creating an eerie effect where she could sense reactions without clearly understanding them. The duration of these theatrical performances was carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact. Sessions lasted between 6 and 12 hours, long enough to exhaust Isabella's emotional and physical reserves, but not so long that the audience lost interest. The timing was designed to coincide with natural human energy cycles, beginning when she was most alert and ending when her resistance was lowest. Multiple sessions were scheduled over weeks or months, creating a sustained performance that became the central focus of her existence. Between theatrical sessions, Isabella was subjected to what the Inquisition called rehearsal preparation. This involved intensive coaching sessions where she was taught how to deliver more convincing performances. Inquisitors critiqued her previous appearances, pointing out moments where her emotion seemed forced, her theology seemed uncertain, or her repentance seemed incomplete. She was given specific acting techniques designed to make her confessions more believable, including methods for generating authentic tears, controlling vocal tremor, and maintaining eye contact while describing traumatic experiences. The rehearsal process included practice sessions with mock audiences, composed of Inquisition personnel playing the roles of skeptical citizens. Isabella had to perfect her performance in front of people who knew it was an act, convincing them to react as if her confession was genuine. This created a surreal environment where everyone involved knew they were participating in elaborate fiction, but the consequences for Isabella were entirely real. The costume department maintained an extensive wardrobe of sanbenitos designed for different types of crimes and levels of repentance. Isabella's garment was modified after each performance based on the audience's reaction and the Inquisitor's assessment of her spiritual progress. Additional symbols were painted on, colors were changed, and the fit was adjusted to reflect her changing status within the Inquisition's theological framework. The evolving costume served as a visual timeline of her supposed spiritual journey from damnation toward potential redemption. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the theater was how it made Isabella complicit in her own destruction. She wasn't simply a victim being tortured, she was a performer whose survival depended on her ability to convince audiences that she deserved the punishment she was receiving. Every convincing moment of her performance validated the Inquisition's methods. Every tear she shed in character became evidence that their techniques were spiritually beneficial. She was forced to become an advocate for her own persecution. The audience selection process revealed the Inquisition's sophisticated understanding of social psychology. Spectators weren't chosen randomly. They were carefully selected based on their relationships to Isabella, their social positions, and their psychological profiles. The audience typically included people who had known her before her arrest, creating additional pressure to maintain her performance in front of individuals who could detect inconsistencies with her previous character. Family members were often required to attend these theatrical sessions, adding another dimension of psychological torture. Isabella had to perform her confession and repentance in front of her children, husband, and parents, knowing that her performance would affect their treatment by the Inquisition. If she was convincing enough, they might be spared investigation. If her performance was inadequate, they would face their own theatrical trials. The welfare of everyone she loved depended on her acting ability. The legal framework surrounding these theatrical performances created additional psychological pressure. Isabella's confession had to satisfy not just emotional and spiritual criteria, but complex legal requirements that determined her ultimate fate. Her words were being recorded by scribes who would analyze them for consistency, theological accuracy, and legal sufficiency. A performance that was emotionally convincing but legally inadequate would result in continued torture until she could deliver lines that satisfied all criteria simultaneously. The religious choreography involved elaborate rituals designed to maximize the spiritual impact of each performance. Isabella's confessions were interspersed with prayers, hymns, and ceremonial actions that required her participation. She had to kneel at specific moments, make religious gestures on cue, and respond appropriately to liturgical prompts while maintaining the emotional intensity of her confession. The integration of religious ceremony with personal trauma created a blasphemous parody of authentic worship. The medical monitoring during these performances was more sophisticated than in purely physical torture sessions. Physicians observed not just Isabella's physical condition, but her psychological state, measuring stress responses, emotional authenticity, and mental coherence. They could recommend modifications to the theatrical format based on their assessment of her psychological capacity. The goal was to push her to the absolute limits of human endurance, without allowing complete mental collapse that would make further performances impossible. The documentation of these theatrical sessions created an archive of human suffering that served multiple purposes within the Inquisition hierarchy. Successful performances were studied and analyzed to improve techniques for future cases. Failed performances were examined to understand what had gone wrong and how similar failures could be prevented. The recordings became training materials for inquisitors throughout the Spanish Empire, spreading the most effective psychological manipulation techniques across continents. The aftermath of successful theatrical performances was almost as psychologically devastating as the performances themselves. Isabella, having convinced an audience that she deserved punishment and had benefited from correction, was released back into society, carrying the psychological burden of having advocated for her own persecution. She had to continue living among people who had witnessed her public humiliation and self-condemnation, knowing that any deviation from her performed repentance could trigger renewed investigation. The social consequences extended beyond Isabella to her entire community. The theatrical performances served as public education about the dangers of heresy and the benefits of Inquisition intervention. Community members who witnessed these elaborate confessions learned not just what behaviors were forbidden, but how completely the Inquisition could transform human personality when those behaviors were detected. The theater became a form of preventive psychological warfare that shaped community behavior for generations. The children who attended these performances received particularly intensive psychological conditioning. They were taught to see the theatrical confessions as examples of authentic spiritual transformation, learning to associate genuine emotion with public self-condemnation. Many developed psychological patterns where they could only feel authentic religious emotion when participating in similar public denunciations of themselves or others. The theater created generational cycles of psychological dysfunction that outlasted the Inquisition itself. The economic dimension of theatrical punishment was as calculated as every other aspect. The elaborate productions required significant resources, but they generated revenue through multiple channels. Attendance fees were charged to spectators who weren't required to attend. Wealthy families paid additional fees to ensure their relatives received more favorable treatment during performances. The costumes and props were rented to other Inquisition offices, creating a touring theater network that spread successful psychological techniques throughout the empire. The technological innovations in theatrical torture influenced entertainment and judicial proceedings throughout Europe. The acoustic engineering, lighting design, and audience management techniques developed in Inquisition chambers were adopted by legitimate theaters, creating an ironic situation where entertainment venues used technologies originally designed for psychological destruction. The legal theater concepts influenced court procedures, introducing performance elements into judicial proceedings that persist in modified forms today. The training programs for inquisitors included extensive instruction in theatrical techniques, transforming religious prosecutors into skilled performers capable of manipulating audience emotions, and victim psychology with professional competence. These training programs created a class of specialists who understood human nature with disturbing sophistication, combining religious authority with psychological expertise and theatrical skill in ways that made them uniquely capable of systematic mental destruction. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of theatrical torture was how it made psychological destruction entertaining. For audiences who genuinely believed they were witnessing spiritual healing. The performances were designed to generate authentic emotional responses from spectators who felt they were participating in sacred rituals of redemption and justice. The theater transformed torture from a hidden atrocity into a public celebration, making entire communities complicit in systematic psychological destruction while believing they were supporting divine justice. Isabella's theatrical journey lasted 14 months and involved 37 separate performances before audiences ranging from 12 to over 200 people. By the end, she had become so skilled at generating authentic emotional responses on command that even she could no longer distinguish between performed repentance and genuine feeling. The Inquisition had achieved something unprecedented in the history of human cruelty. They had transformed their victim into a willing collaborator in her own psychological destruction, creating a form of torture that continued indefinitely through the victim's own actions, long after the formal punishment had ended.